Just a certification. That was what Dr. Richard Pierce said when he first saw Margaret Walsh's personnel file, the words dropping from his mouth like a judgment already rendered. He sat in his glass-walled office on the third floor of St. Michael's Emergency Department in Denver, the file open under the harsh fluorescent light, and felt the familiar heat of professional indignation rise in his chest. A bachelor's degree. That was the minimum threshold for respect in emergency medicine. That was the credential that separated the serious physicians from he paused, searching for the word, the others. The Accelerated Nursing Certification Program. He'd heard of it, the kind of fast-track credential that hospitals used when they were desperate for bodies, when they cared more about filling shifts than maintaining standards. 3 years at St. Michael's, the file said. 0 patient complaints. Flawless performance reviews from the previous chief of medicine, Dr. Sarah Holloway, who had since retired and left Pierce to inherit her catastrophically mismanaged department. He read the reviews twice, looking for cracks in the narrative, some hint of corners cut or protocols bent, but the language was frustratingly pristine. Exceptional clinical judgment. Demonstrates mastery under pressure. Natural aptitude for trauma stabilization. The last review ended with a handwritten note in Holloway's looping cursive, "Margaret is the best emergency nurse I've encountered in 30 years of practice. Guard her carefully." Pierce closed the file. He didn't read it as praise. He read it as a warning sign that standards had eroded catastrophically under his predecessor's watch, that competence without proper credentials had somehow been allowed to flourish, and that the hospital's culture would need significant realignment now that he was in charge. The emergency department hummed with its usual Tuesday afternoon rhythm, the ventilator in curtain area 2 wheezed its mechanical pulse, the monitors beat their 6-beat patterns, shoes squeaked against the polished linoleum as nurses moved between patients. Pierce positioned himself at the nurses' station, ostensibly reviewing charts, actually watching the floor with the intensity of a newly appointed chief who understood that first impressions were institutional. His medical degree hung on the wall behind him, framed in mahogany, his name embossed in gold, Richard Pierce, M.D., Yale School of Medicine. His residency had been rigorous, his fellowship competitive, his pedigree unassailable. He'd trained under Dr. Harrison, the mentor who still held considerable influence over regional medical education, and that connection had been instrumental in securing this position. He was 38 years old and had never once questioned whether he belonged in a room. He certainly wasn't about to start now because a nurse without a bachelor's degree seemed to move through crisis with unsettling confidence. Margaret Walsh emerged from curtain area 3 carrying a blood pressure cuff, and Pierce watched her with the kind of clinical detachment he might apply to observing a surgical specimen. She was in her mid-40s, brown hair pulled back in a practical braid, the kind of efficient appearance that suggested she didn't consider her looks part of her job. Her scrubs were navy blue, standard issue, with a small laminated badge clipped to her pocket, Margaret Walsh, RN. No credential abbreviations after her name. Just RN, the same as every other nurse in the department. She moved through the crowded trauma bay with the economical precision of someone who had mapped every inch of this space and knew exactly where her body needed to be without conscious thought. When she reached the patient in curtain area for a 63-year-old man with chest pain admitted 2 hours earlier, her hands moved through the blood pressure assessment with a fluidity that Pierce couldn't immediately categorize. The cuff application was textbook. The inflation pressure was confident. The reading was called aloud with a kind of clarity that suggested she was used to being heard in crisis. But something about the quality of her movement troubled him, something he couldn't quite articulate but that registered as wrong in his carefully calibrated understanding of medical hierarchy. It was as if her hand knew something her credentials didn't justify. Over the next 4 hours, Pierce made observations. He noted that the residents deferred to Margaret Walsh without conscious thought. When Dr. Matthews, one of his second-year residents, was struggling to place an 4 on a difficult patient, a diabetic with scarred veins, it was Margaret who came over silently, assessed the situation in 3 seconds, and said something inaudible that made Matthews step back and let her take the needle. She placed the 4 on the first stick, the angiocath sliding into the vein with an audible whisper, and then she was gone, moving to the next crisis. He noted that when the trauma alert sounded at 3:22 p.m., motorcycle versus truck on 6th Avenue, 1 patient, ETA 5 minutes, Every staff member moved into position with the synchronized chaos of a well-practiced drill, but Margaret was already gathering supplies before anyone asked, already anticipating which medications would be needed, already positioning the trauma bay for someone she hadn't yet met. He noted all of this and felt it accumulate like evidence in a legal brief, facts that would support his growing conviction that something in the system had become corrupted by Holloway's poor judgment. The motorcycle accident patient arrived at 3:52 p.m., a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, his left leg badly mangled, the femur fractured in at least 2 places, road rash covering his exposed skin in dark, gritty abrasions that made the emergency team wince collectively. The paramedics had him secured on the trauma stretcher, an oxygen mask already in place, his forearm wrapped in gauze from where the asphalt had torn into his skin. Pierce arrived in the trauma bay just as Margaret was checking his pulse, her fingers finding the carotid artery with the kind of certainty that suggested she was reading something underneath the skin that no one else could access. The patient was conscious, barely, his eyes moving with the confused animal awareness of someone in severe shock. Margaret's voice dropped into a register that Pierce hadn't heard before, something lower and more resonant than her usual speech, and she said to the patient, "You're at St. Michael's. You're safe. We're going to fix you." It wasn't reassurance. It was a statement of fact delivered with the kind of absolute certainty that made something shift in the patient's terrified face, made his breathing slow marginally, made the terror recede just enough to let the medical team work. Pierce watched her for placement on the patient's right arm, 2 large bore lines, 18 gauge, placed with such fluid competence that he couldn't mount any legitimate criticism. He watched her call out the patient's vitals in that same clear, resonant voice, watched her apply pressure to the worst of the abrasions with the kind of precision that suggested she understood exactly how much pressure was needed to stop bleeding without causing additional tissue damage. The young Army Ranger, his military ID was visible in his wallet, 75th Ranger Regiment, Fort Benning, had a tattoo on his forearm beneath the road rash, neat script lettering that read Captain Walsh in military stencil. It was partially obscured by the gauze wrapping, just a fragment of letters visible, and no one on the trauma team seemed to notice or register the significance. Pierce certainly didn't. He was too focused on Margaret's movements, too intent on finding the moment where her lack of credentials would become evident, where she would hesitate or miscalculate or reveal the gaps in her training. It never came. By 5 o'clock, the patient was stabilized, his leg immobilized, his bleeding controlled, his shock managed with fluid resuscitation and careful monitoring. He would be heading to orthopedic surgery within the hour, his prognosis favorable given the quality of the pre-hospital and emergency stabilization. The trauma team dispersed, moving back to their other patients, back to the endless stream of human suffering that the emergency department processed like a factory of intervention and hope. Margaret began cleaning the trauma bay with the methodical care of someone who understood that the space would need to be pristine for the next crisis, and that next crisis could arrive in minutes. She wiped down the monitors with disinfectant, the smell of bleach rising acrid and sharp in the artificial air. She replaced the linens on the gurney with practiced efficiency, her hands moving as if they performed this exact sequence 10,000 times. Which, Pierce realized, they probably had. He returned to his glass office and made his first formal notation in Margaret Walsh's personnel file. Concerns regarding potential protocol deviations, he wrote, though he knew, even as he wrote it, that he had no specific incident to cite, no measurable deviation to document. But protocols could be interpreted in multiple ways. Initiative could be read as overreach. Confidence without credentials could be reframed as recklessness. The file already contained the foundation he needed, the lack of a bachelor's degree, the accelerated certification, the implicit suggestion that she didn't belong in the same professional category as the physicians who had attended 4-year universities. Everything else was just documentation. Everything else was building the case methodically, the way one constructed an argument in medicine, fact upon fact upon fact, until the conclusion became inevitable. He closed the file and smiled, the smile of a man who had just identified the first thread he could pull to unravel something that had been stitched together carelessly by a predecessor who hadn't understood the necessity of maintaining proper hierarchy. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Margaret Walsh had no idea any of this had begun. The systematic destruction began with whispers. Dr. Pierce pulled resident Dr. Chen aside during morning rounds, his voice low and conspiratorial. Margaret Walsh? Capable enough, but she cuts corners. Watch her medication timing, I've had to correct her twice this month. The lie spread through the resident pool like infection through an open wound. Within 2 days, every resident on the unit believed Margaret was sloppy, that her accelerated certification meant accelerated mistakes, that her flawless performance reviews were somehow the result of luck or manipulation rather than skill. He didn't stop there. Dr. Pierce rearranged the master schedule, a task that fell under his authority as Chief of Emergency Medicine. Margaret worked every holiday that year: Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, Easter. While the other nurses, the ones with bachelor's degrees, the ones with his approval, received preferred scheduling and weekend time off, Margaret's name appeared on every overnight shift, every double, every assignment nobody wanted. When she appeared for her 4th consecutive weekend, charge nurse Linda looked away rather than meet her eyes. The message was clear. You don't belong here. The first public humiliation came on a Tuesday morning in room 7 with the Kowalski family gathered around their dying father, their faces already etched with the particular grief of watching someone slip away by inches. Dr. Pierce had altered the medication chart 30 minutes earlier, changing Margaret's carefully logged morphine timing from 14 to 13:20. He knew she would never contradict him directly. He was counting on that. He summoned her into the room, his voice loud enough to carry into the hallway where other staff members paused their work to listen. Nurse Walsh, can you explain why Mr. Kowalski received his pain medication 40 minutes late? The family turned to stare at her. Margaret's hand stilled on the 4-pole. One measured breath. She did not flush. She did not tremble. Doctor, I administered at 2 p.m. as ordered. The chart says 13:20, he interrupted, his voice taking on the tone of a man disappointed by incompetence. Are you calling me a liar, or are you admitting you can't tell time? The daughter gasped. The son's jaw clenched. Margaret's own jaw tightened, a single muscle movement visible for one frame before her composure reasserted itself. Perhaps that accelerated nursing program didn't cover documentation, Dr. Pierce continued, and now he smiled, the smile of a predator who has found no resistance. Dismissed. Margaret turned and walked out. Her pace did not quicken. Her hands did not shake. She walked through the hallway past 3 residents pretending to review charts, past a nursing student who had gone pale, past the intercom that had broadcast her humiliation throughout the unit. She walked to the break room and sat at the table with her dinner, a sandwich she had made at 5 that morning, and opened her laptop to finish a patient note. That evening, the exile came. Margaret entered the break room with her dinner at 19:30, and 5 staff members sat at the table: Emily, Linda, Marcus, and the 2 new nurses whose names she had learned only last week. Emily saw her first and stood immediately, her chair scraping across the linoleum with a sound like an accusation. One by one they all stood, Linda gathering her food, Marcus closing his laptop, the 2 newer nurses following without question, and filed out without a word, without eye contact, without acknowledgement. They left their half-eaten meals on the table, a deliberate statement. We will not sit with you. Margaret stood alone in the empty room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the drone of 1,000 beehives. She could hear the muffled sounds of the ER beyond the walls, monitors beeping, a page overhead, the distant sound of a helicopter rotors approaching the helipad 3 floors above. She looked at her reflection in the microwave door glass, that dark metallic surface that showed her image in fragmented silver tones. One tear traced down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the pressure of 18 years of holding everything together. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking her reflection's gaze and whispered to the empty room, "You don't know what I've carried." She reached into her nursing bag and pressed her fingers against the folded flag, the one from the team member she had carried out of Baghdad herself, the one she was never supposed to mention, never supposed to acknowledge, the one that was the only proof she had ever been anyone at all. Her hands were steady as she touched it. The final humiliation was public and meticulously calculated. The next morning, Dr. Pierce posted a formal write-up on the unit's bulletin board where every staff member gathered for shift assignments and schedule changes. Disciplinary notice, M. Walsh, repeated protocol violations, medication errors, insubordinate behavior. Formal review pending. 20 staff members read it during morning huddle while Margaret stood 10 feet away, her composure intact, her hand steady, her voice completely absent from any defense or explanation. She simply received the assignment sheet from Linda, checked her schedule for more consecutive overnight shifts, and walked toward her first patient. But that wasn't the worst part. At 21:36 that same evening, the waiting room erupted like a breach in a dam. A man burst through the automatic doors, 6'5" at minimum, shoulders like a linebacker straining against the fabric of a torn field jacket, his arms wrapped around his collapsed brother. Blood, or what looked like motor oil mixed with blood, streaked his sleeves. His brother's lips had turned the peculiar blue-gray of someone who couldn't breathe, gasping in the repetitive desperate rhythm of a fish left on a dock. "Help! Somebody fucking help!" His voice was raw combat desperation, the kind of sound that comes from watching someone you've protected die in front of you. The waiting room scattered like scattered rounds. A pregnant woman grabbed her child and ran toward the parking lot. An elderly man knocked over his walker fleeing toward the bathrooms. A teenager with a twisted ankle abandoned his crutch on the floor. Behind the triage desk, 2 nurses dropped their clipboards and disappeared into the med room, locking the door behind them with an audible click. The security guard, a 60-year-old named Dennis who had worked the ER for 8 years, backed toward his station with his hand hovering near the panic button. Margaret Walsh stood at the nurse's station 20 feet away, finishing a chart note for a patient she had just discharged. She set down her pen with the same measured calm she had once used approaching Iraqi insurgent checkpoints in the Jolan district of Fallujah, back when she had been someone else entirely. One breath. Just one. She looked up and her eyes tracked the brother's presentation in the space of that single heartbeat, cyanotic lips, neck veins distended like ropes under the skin, visible tracheal deviation. The asymmetry of his chest wall. The way his gasps came from desperation rather than capacity. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung was compressing his heart. She had maybe 90 seconds before his blood pressure bottomed out and he died right there in front of the vending machines and the broken television in the corner. She stood from her chair and walked toward them, not running, because running would panic the brother, not hesitating because hesitation would signal uncertainty, just steady as sunrise. Her eyes never left the collapsed man's face. Her hands were already calculating distances and angles and what she would need. "Sir, I need you to follow me." Her voice cut through his panic like a scalpel through anesthetized skin. Something in her tone, command without aggression, authority without cruelty, made him pivot immediately and follow her toward Trauma Bay 2. She hit the wall intercom with one hand while opening the crash cart with the other. Trauma team to Bay 2, tension pneumothorax, patient coding, ETA 1 minute. Then she looked at the brother, really looked at him, and her hands were already reaching for the 14-gauge angiocath needle, already moving through the muscle memory of a procedure she had performed exactly 3 times in her life but thousands of times in her training. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. O2 saturation climbing from 68 to 72 to 78. She would need a chest tube next, would need a surgeon within the hour, would need to do this right or watch another person die on her hands, and the only thing that moved in her body was her hands, steady as surgical steel. The waiting room doors burst open at 9:08 p.m. and a man emerged who seemed to bend the space around him, 6'4", shoulders like a linebacker, field jacket torn at the left shoulder where blood had already begun to darken the fabric. His brother hung limp in his arms, head tilted back, skin the color of wet concrete. "Help! Somebody help me!" The man's voice cracked like breaking glass. He's not breathing, he's not, please, God, somebody. The waiting room fractured. A woman with a child grabbed her purse and moved toward the exit. An elderly couple pressed themselves against the far wall. A man checking his phone stood abruptly and walked, then quickened to a near run, toward the parking lot. The triage nurse fumbled for the phone. A security guard took 3 steps back. The entire room moved away from the crisis like water parting around a stone. All except one. Margaret Walsh stood from her chair in the corner where she'd been charting on a tablet between her shifts, and she walked toward them. Not rushed. Not panicked. The same measured pace she'd once used approaching insurgent checkpoints in Fallujah, when the difference between appearing controlled and appearing afraid meant the difference between being waved through and having your vehicle searched for explosives. Her hands were already moving, scanning, assessing, her mind translating what her eyes saw into a hierarchy of trauma. "Bring him through," she said to no one. To everyone. The authority in her voice was so complete that two nurses who'd been frozen in the hallway pivoted and grabbed a gurney without waiting for an order that had technically never come from anyone in charge. The collapsed brother hit the stretcher with the sound of dead weight meeting metal, a dull thud that echoed through the bay. His lips were darkening from blue to purple, a bruise spreading upward from his jaw. Margaret's fingers found his carotid, the notch where the artery runs just beneath skin, and found nothing. No pulse. No time. 45 seconds until complete systemic failure, until the brain began dying from lack of oxygen, until saving him shifted from medicine to necromancy. She tore open his shirt. Buttons scattered across the trauma bay floor like spent brass casings. His chest wall was hyper-expanded on the right side, distended like a balloon overfilled by a child. The muscle of his intercostal spaces was taut and rigid, not moving with breath because breath wasn't moving at all. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis arrived in her hands before it could form as words in her mind, muscle memory that reached back through a decade, back through another lifetime in another desert where a medic named Walsh had learned to trust her hands more than her voice. She palpated the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Found the landmarks. Her hands were someone else's hands now, attached to someone else's nervous system, operating from muscle memory older than her civilian identity. The large man in the field jacket grabbed her wrist. His grip was industrial strength, the kind that came from a lifetime of loading weight, of physical labor, of real work. His eyes were terror and fury and desperate hope all braided together. "What are you doing? What the hell are you?" "Saving him," Margaret said. "Let go." He released her. She didn't register whether it was because he trusted her or because something in her voice made not listening feel impossible. She prepped the site with betadine in 3 strokes. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The antiseptic smell rose sharp and chemical, filling the small pocket of space around the patient's exposed chest. She reached for the 14-gauge needle. Her fingers found it like they'd been reaching for it for the last 10 years, like her hands had been waiting for permission from her brain to become what they'd always been trained to be. Behind her, the trauma bay doors burst open with a pneumatic whisper of a hydraulic system. Dr. Pierce entered first, his white coat still pressed and pristine despite the hour, 2 residents flanking him like an entourage. He took in the scene in one sweeping assessment, Margaret's hands moving, the collapsed patient, the large man standing vigil, the nurses standing ready with equipment Margaret hadn't asked for but had somehow anticipated needing. "Nurse Walsh, step away from that patient," Dr. Pierce said. His voice was ice sliding across hardwood. Not loud. Surgical. The voice of someone who'd learned that cruelty didn't require volume. Margaret didn't turn. "He has 30 seconds. You are not authorized to perform emergency procedures. You will step away from that patient immediately, or I will have you removed from this hospital." She inserted the needle between the ribs, angled over the superior margin of the 3rd rib, pushed through the pleural space with the sensation of puncturing something that had been sealed. The resistance gave way like tissue paper. The moment of penetration lasted perhaps half a second. Then came the release, the sound of compressed air escaping, the hiss of a tire deflating after 12 hours in the sun, the pneumothorax decompressing as the pressure that had been crushing the patient's lungs for God knew how long finally had somewhere to go. The patient's chest wall relaxed visibly. The hyper-expanded right side deflated like a balloon after a birthday party. His lips shifted from purple to blue to pink in the span of 3 seconds. A pulse returned under her fingers, steady and strong, the carotid suddenly alive beneath her touch. 84 beats per minute. The patient gasped, a real breath, not the convulsive gasp of someone drowning in air, but a genuine breath that filled his lungs. The large man sobbed once, a sound that came from somewhere beneath his sternum. He grabbed Margaret's shoulder, his grip hard enough to bruise. Thank you, Jesus Christ, thank you. Margaret disposed of the needle in the sharps container. Red biohazard label catching the fluorescent light. She looked up at the monitors, oxygen saturation climbing from 72 to 81 to 88. Pulse steady. Blood pressure beginning to stabilize. The worst was past. The trauma team would take over now, and they would do their jobs well because she'd done hers. Trauma team will take over now, she said. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. There was nothing in her bearing to suggest that she'd just performed a procedure outside her documented scope of practice, that she'd violated approximately 14 different hospital policies, that she'd saved someone who would have died in the time it took her to explain why she couldn't touch him. Dr. Pierce stood frozen near the doorway. His face was doing mathematics, calculating vectors, running scenarios through the chess engine of a strategic mind. He'd walked into that trauma bay expecting to find a nurse making a mistake. Instead, he'd found a nurse with hands that moved like they'd been trained by institutions he didn't have clearance to know about. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Pierce turned and walked out of the bay. Margaret followed him. She could feel the weight of eyes, the residents staring, the nurses staring, the Army Ranger from Curtin Area 3 who'd wheeled his footpole into the hallway and was watching her pass, something flickering behind his eyes like a pilot light trying to ignite. Recognition, maybe. Or just the random neural firing of a brain that had been scattered by an IED blast in a firefight whose classified designation he'd never be cleared to remember, in a location his medical records officially described only as a theater of operations. She didn't look at him. She'd learned that lesson a long time ago, the lesson about not making eye contact with people who might remember you from a different life, a different rank, a different name on a different kind of uniform. Dr. Pierce's office door closed behind her with a soft click. He moved to his desk with the unhurried grace of someone whose sense of control had never been seriously challenged. His hand found the phone. He didn't look at Margaret, didn't acknowledge her presence. He simply picked up the receiver and dialed 3 numbers, and Margaret understood in that moment that the real emergency had just begun, because Dr. Pierce wasn't panicked. Dr. Pierce was thinking. And a man who thought clearly was far more dangerous than a man who simply reacted. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered. Dr. Pierce's voice was calm, professional, the tone of a man calling about weather or restaurant reservations. This is Dr. Richard Pierce, Chief of Emergency Medicine at St. Michael's, Denver. I need to report a serious protocol violation. I have a nurse practicing medicine without appropriate credentialing. Yes. I'll hold. Margaret stood in the center of his office and waited for the second phone call, the one to risk management, the one that would begin the machinery that was designed to move people like her out of places like this. She'd spent 3 years building a reputation that could be dismantled in 3 minutes by a man with an institutional grievance and access to the right channels. She'd spent 3 years convincing herself that this life, the civilian life, the quiet life, the life where Captain Margaret Walsh stayed buried, was enough. That she was done being someone the world needed. That she could live with her hands folded, staying still, being nobody. The phone rang again. Dr. Pierce picked it up immediately, as if someone had been waiting. Dr. Pierce closed the conference room door and picked up his office phone. The handset felt light in his grip, almost an afterthought. His calendar showed 3 names, 3 calls that would take 10 minutes total. 10 minutes to destroy a life with paperwork and institutional protocol. He dialed Nursing Director Sandra Winters first. She answered on the second ring. Sandra, it's Richard. We have a serious problem. His voice carried the weight of concern, not accusation. This was the art of it. Margaret Walsh performed an invasive procedure yesterday without physician authorization. Tension pneumothorax decompression. Yes, the patient stabilized, but that's not the point. The protocol violation is what matters. She's a liability we cannot afford. I need her badge pulled before shift change. He listened to Sandra's response, nodding though she couldn't see him. No, I understand her history here. That's precisely the problem. 3 years of performance reviews don't excuse unauthorized advanced procedures. Thank you, Sandra. He hung up. Call 2. Risk management. Jim Torres answered on the third ring. Jim, Dr. Pierce. I'm documenting a protocol breach from yesterday that requires immediate intervention. His words came measured, precise, each one a brick in a legal wall. One of our nursing staff performed needle decompression for tension pneumothorax without physician authorization or supervision. If she'd been wrong, if that patient had arrested, we'd be facing a wrongful death suit. I've reviewed her employment file. No credentials for advanced procedures. No advanced certification beyond her accelerated nursing program. This is dangerous. I need her badge deactivated today, and I'm filing a formal incident report. He waited for the legal department to process his words. Yes, documented. Everything documented. Within the hour, please. He set the phone down. The third call was different. This one wasn't about Margaret at all. This one was insurance. Dr. Harrison answered his personal line, had for 30 years, would probably answer it for 30 more. His mentor. The man who taught him that medicine wasn't just about patients, but about power structures, about knowing who owed you favors. Who you owed favors to? Harrison, it's Richard. I'm calling to keep you informed about something developing here at St. Michael's. His voice shifted, became confidential, collegial. We're addressing a dangerous protocol breach. One of our nurses performed an invasive procedure without authorization. I've documented everything meticulously. The incident is being handled through proper channels, administration, risk management, the full process. I wanted you to hear it from me first, given your position on the state board. Just keeping the chain informed. No action needed on your end, just visibility. He let Harrison respond, let the older physician absorb the implications. A nurse flagged for protocol violations. A young doctor ensuring his mentor knew about it first. Thank you, Harrison. I appreciate your mentorship. He hung up. The calls took 9 minutes and 37 seconds. In that span of time, he transformed Margaret from an employee into a liability, from a nurse into a protocol violator, from a person into a problem that needed solving. By noon, Security Chief Martinez appeared at Margaret's side as she stood at the nurse's station, charting vitals from the morning rounds. His presence felt like gravity changing direction. He wore the expression of a man delivering sentences, not messages. Ms. Walsh, I need your badge and locker key. His voice was quiet, which made it worse than shouting. Margaret's hand stilled above the keyboard. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical song, indifferent to the words being spoken. Around her, staff found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. A sudden spike in charting, an unexpected supply inventory, a bathroom break that couldn't be delayed. The room didn't empty, it just turned away. What? Margaret's voice came steady, but it wasn't a question. It was the sound of a question mark turning into a period. Your employment has been terminated effective immediately. Dr. Pierce's orders. Martinez extended his hand, palm up. The gesture of someone collecting debts. The badge and the key. She removed her ID badge, the laminate showing a photograph of a woman rebuilt from ashes, a woman who'd learned to smile for hospital cameras, and handed it over. She removed her locker key from her scrub's pocket. The metal felt warm from her body heat. She pressed both items into his palm. Security walked her to the locker room. The space smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee and the faint metallic tang of bandage adhesive. Her locker was already open. All her personal items, the framed photo of Emma from 3rd grade, the calendar from the blood bank, the half-empty container of hand sanitizer, had been removed and placed in a hospital-issued cardboard box. It was the kind of box used for patient belongings after discharge. Or death. Beneath the box contents, at the bottom of the locker, sat the folded flag. 13 folds, the way they taught you in the military. The colors, red and white and blue, visible through the gaps, carefully preserved, carefully hidden. It was from her last deployment, from the rescue operation that had gone sideways, from the moment she'd carried 3 bleeding soldiers 2 kilometers through hostile fire. One of them didn't make it back. The flag was his, folded by hand she didn't know, given to her by a colonel who understood what it meant. What she'd done. Who she'd been. She picked it up and tucked it into her nursing bag, beneath the vinyl and cloth, pressed against the textured nylon like a secret. The drive home took 17 minutes. She didn't remember the route. Her hands operated the steering wheel, her eyes tracked traffic lights, her muscle memory did the work while her mind hung suspended in a state of professional unreality. By 2 o'clock, she was sitting at her kitchen table. The table was solid oak, a wedding present from a marriage that belonged to someone else now. She'd bought it at an estate sale with cash, no names, no history. Emma came home from school at 3:15. The backpack dropped with a soft thud. The sound of keys jingling in a child's hands. The sound of normalcy. "Mom? Why are you home?" Emma's voice carried the confusion of disrupted patterns. Children relied on patterns the way deep-sea creatures relied on pressure. Remove it, and something fundamental breaks. Margaret couldn't speak. The words existed, she knew what they were, understood the grammar, could construct the sentences. But speaking them aloud would make them real. Would transform a nightmare into documented fact. "Mom, why are you crying?" Emma was 9.5, old enough to understand that her mother was crying, too young to understand why that was terrifying. Margaret pulled her daughter into an embrace and held her there, breathing in the scent of playground and apple juice and childhood. How could she explain? That she'd been Captain Margaret Walsh, 3rd Ranger Battalion, callsign Reaper. That she'd led a classified operation in Baghdad, August 2014, that had gone sideways 3 minutes into the extraction. That she'd picked up Sergeant Torres with one arm and Private Chen with the other, both bleeding from shrapnel wounds, and carried them 2 kilometers through streets where every window could contain a weapon. That she'd refused evacuation until Ranger Kellerman was secure, until every soldier under her command was moving, breathing, alive. That the Pentagon had classified the operation, erased her from official records, handed her a new identity and a new life and told her never to surface again. Never be visible. Never be known. Never be captain again. "I love you, baby. Everything will be okay." The lie tasted like copper and ash. The email arrived at 6 o'clock. Her personal email, the one only hospital staff had. Dr. Pierce's address. Subject line, mandatory all-staff meeting. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. All emergency medicine personnel. Topic, dangerous protocols and unauthorized practitioners. Attendance is required. Margaret read the subject line 3 times. Each word was a stone placed in her pocket. By the 4th reading, she was drowning. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat against the oak surface, feeling its grain beneath her palms. The folded flag was upstairs in her bedroom, hidden in the base of her closet, pressed beneath a winter coat. Physical evidence of a life the Pentagon had erased. The only proof that Captain Margaret Walsh had ever existed at all. Outside, Denver rain began to fall, the kind of rain that came in late afternoon and reminded you that summer was ending, that seasons changed, that nothing lasted. The downpour hammered the kitchen window like applause, like judgment, like the sound of a door closing that would never open again. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was waiting in a conference room 17 hours away, where 50 people would gather to hear Dr. Pierce explain why a nurse named Margaret Walsh was dangerous. The worst part was that she couldn't stop herself from being there to hear it. The worst part was that she still believed, somehow, that the truth might matter. She didn't know that the truth was already walking through Denver wearing a uniform, carrying a folder, about to change everything. The Army Ranger from Curtin Area 3 appeared in the hospital lobby at 7:38 a.m., still bandaged across his left shoulder, still moving with the careful precision of someone relearning how to exist in a body that had betrayed him. He'd spent the night thinking about hands. Not his own, hers. The nurse who'd found him in the waiting room chaos, who'd moved like someone who'd done this before in places where doing it wrong meant more than losing a job. He remembered the sensation of her touch on his chest, the absolute certainty in her fingers as she positioned the needle. Not hesitation. Not fear. Just competence so clean it felt like prayer. He rode the elevator to the 4th floor where the all-staff meeting was scheduled. He looked up the calendar on the hospital website. He didn't know why. Something in his shattered memory kept reaching for her face, kept failing to grasp it, the way his hand kept reaching for details that the IED blast in Baghdad had burned away. But her hands he remembered. Hands steady as surgical steel. Hands that had held something precious while everything else was burning. The conference room was already half full when he slipped through the doors. Dr. Pierce stood at the podium, adjusting the microphone with the measured authority of a man who'd built his entire identity on the assumption that credentials and volume were the same as competence. The ranger's eye scanned the room, nurses clustered in small groups, residents in the back corner, administrators in the first 3 rows. And then he saw her. Standing alone at the back wall, still in street clothes, no badge, no ID, watching the room with the kind of stillness that only came from having learned how to disappear in hostile territory. Their eyes found each other across 60 feet and 12 rows of folding chairs. His face transformed. Not slowly. Not in stages. In the single instant that recognition detonated across his nervous system like a second blast, one that brought light instead of darkness. His mouth opened. One word escaped, whispered but audible in the moment before Dr. Pierce's opening remarks, Reaper. The room went dead silent. Margaret's expression didn't change. She didn't move. But something shifted in her eyes, acknowledgement, acceptance, the moment a secret stops being theoretical and becomes real. The ranger's hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone, scrolling through notes he'd kept for 8 years, notes written in a hospital bed by a military chaplain transcribing details from a soldier's fragments of memory. His thumb found the citation, and he read it aloud in a voice that cracked like a teenage boy's. Captain Margaret Walsh, callsign Reaper, carried 3 wounded through 2 clicks of hostile fire in Baghdad, refused evacuation until every soldier was secured. He looked up from the screen. She wouldn't leave us. She came back 3 times. Dr. Pierce's face had gone the color of old plaster. He moved toward the microphone as if he could somehow control the narrative, rewrite the moment into something manageable, when the conference room doors opened and a Marine colonel entered wearing dress blues, a folder under his arm thick as a briefing document. Behind him came Dr. Harrison, the older man who'd mentored Pierce through medical school, who'd watched his brilliant protégé transform into something smaller and meaner with each passing year. The colonel approached the podium with the gait of someone accustomed to rooms reorganizing themselves around his presence. Dr. Pierce, I'm Colonel James Mercer, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. I'm here on behalf of the Department of Defense to address the unauthorized disclosure of classified personnel records. He opened the folder. Margaret's entire service file lay exposed, redacted sections now declassified, medals listed with their citations, decorations that officially didn't exist 36 hours ago suddenly very real and very documented. Dr. Harrison stepped forward. His eyes found Pierce's, and in that gaze was everything: disappointment, recognition of wasted potential, the full weight of knowing someone intimately and watching them choose smallness. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that everyone in the room had to lean forward to hear it. I taught you medicine, Richard. Anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, every clinical tool you needed to save lives. He paused. The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent hum. I clearly failed to teach you honor. The suspension came through official channels within 7 days. The State Medical Board issued the notice on a Thursday morning, Dr. Pierce's privileges restricted, his hospital badge deactivated, his office cleared by security before he'd even received the formal notification. He sat in his car in the St. Michael's parking lot at noon, the same parking lot where he'd watched Margaret load a cardboard box into her trunk 48 hours earlier, and felt something inside him that had always felt invincible finally break into component parts. Margaret's Pentagon records were quietly restored by an office in Arlington with no official name. The declassification was handled as a matter of national security interest. An officer whose cover had been compromised deserved the dignity of acknowledgement, at minimum. The hospital board issued a formal apology. The nursing director reinstated her position with back pay and a promotion to senior emergency medicine nurse. The viral video of her public humiliation accumulated 200,000 views. In the comment section, trauma surgeons and combat medics and soldiers who'd never met her wrote variations on the same theme. We knew. We could tell. You could see it in how she moved. 6 months later, Margaret Walsh stood at the entrance to St. Michael's emergency department in her restored scrubs, her badge clipped to her pocket, her name no longer a liability. Her small office, carved from what used to be a storage room, contained one piece of furniture that mattered, a shadow box mounted on the wall. Inside lay a folded flag, the colors precise and military and final, from a teammate who'd stepped on an IED in Sanjan Valley and never come home. Beside it hung the silver star, its ribbon the color of deep burgundy, its citation engraved on a brass plate beneath. The Army Ranger visited every Tuesday for physical therapy in the rehabilitation wing. Today he walked without assistance, his shoulder mobility nearly restored, his trajectory toward full recovery mapped in increments. He approached Margaret at the nurse's station and wordlessly rolled up his sleeve. The tattoo on his forearm was crisp and black, Captain Walsh. 8 years old. Never faded. You carried me, he said simply. All of us. Margaret touched the letters gently, her fingertip tracing each one. You carried yourselves. I just refused to leave you in the dark. The medical supply van made its route through Denver 5 days a week. Dr. Pierce delivered equipment to clinics and small hospitals, a logistics position created specifically to remove him from any position of authority over living people. He drove past St. Michael's twice weekly, always keeping his eyes forward, never glancing toward the entrance where Margaret had begun mentoring residents with the kind of patience that only comes from having survived things that demanded perfection. He felt no rehabilitation coming. Some bridges, once burned, don't rebuild. They just ash into the landscape and become part of how you navigate the rest of your life. Emma, now 11, waited in the hospital lobby after school while her mother finished her shift, finally understanding why those years had been hidden, finally proud to occupy the space where her mom had rebuilt herself from nothing. The work continued. The emergencies arrived in predictable rhythms. A code blue at 4:15 p.m. sent Margaret moving toward the trauma bay with her limp barely visible now, her hand steady, her past and present finally integrated into a single coherent person. A young resident approached her afterward. How do you stay so calm during chaos? Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that contained multitudes, that held Baghdad and Denver and all the spaces between where she'd learned to transform fear into precision. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She returned to the charts. The work continued. And somewhere in the weight of that continuity was everything that mattered, not vindication, not recognition, but the simple, irreversible fact that she could show up tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that, no longer carrying the weight of erasure. Some things couldn't be erased. Not by orders. Not by bureaucracy. Not by men who'd mistaken authority for competence and learned too late that they were nothing alike. If you found Margaret's quiet strength in the face of systematic destruction powerful, you need to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about the ones who survive in silence. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And share this with someone who needs to remember that real power comes from the ability to help, not the title on your badge.